If you're not familiar with James Young, he's assistant professor of history at the University of Iowa. He completed his PhD at Georgetown in 2021, for which he spent 6 months living in Carlisle, working at both the Historical Society and the County Archives. We got to know Cory pretty well, and we're very excited about the work he was doing. His book manuscript, For Life or Otherwise, Pennsylvania Slavery in the Age of Gradual Abolition, is under contract, with the University of Pennsylvania Press. So super excited to see that as well. There'll be time for questions at the end. So there'll be opportunity for that, or put them in the chat, however you're most comfortable. So I am going to turn it over to Cory.
All right. Thank you, Kara, so much for having me. I also appreciate the opportunity to be able to zoom back into the Historical Society where I started so much of the research for what is now my first book project. And so I'm glad to share some of that with you today. I'd also like to thank Barb Bartos, the wonderful county archivist, for helping me to understand the value of government records and specifically legal records, which I'm going to talk mostly about this evening. I would be remiss not to mention that 2024 is the sesquicentennial of the Cumberland County Historical Society. That's 150 years of that institution, which is pretty remarkable. The organization was founded as the Hamilton Library and Historical Association, named after James Hamilton Jr., a prominent Carlisle resident from a prominent Carlisle family. And I first spoke at the Historical Society 6 years ago in 2018. And I was going back through my slides from that presentation to remind myself what the project looked like 6 years ago, what I was talking about 6 years ago. And I realized I spoke quite a bit about enslaved labor at Dickinson College and at the nearby military barracks. I focused on enslavers' willingness to break up Black families in order to give enslaved laborers to their own children. So the dissolution of Black families as a means of keeping white family networks together. I also spoke about the Hamilton family, after whom the Historical Society was named. In particular, I spoke about James Hamilton's father, the attorney James Hamilton Sr., and his participation in the domestic slave trade, his efforts to try to obtain enslaved laborers from Philadelphia and bring them into the Pennsylvania interior. Uh, but I don't want to talk about that today. 6 years ago, I really focused on the experience of labor, of work, of slavery. But tonight, as you can probably tell from my talk, I want to focus a bit on how Black Pennsylvanians extricated themselves from the institution of bondage. So the title of the talk, Black Freedom Making in the Early National Cumberland Valley. I'll stick to Cumberland County mostly, with some sojourns across the Susquehanna to Lancaster, a couple mentions of Franklin and Dauphin, but anchored in South Central Pennsylvania to be sure. And I want to start by reversing the journey of the domestic slave trade that I spoke about in 2018. Then I was talking about enslaved people going from Philadelphia to Carlisle. But tonight, let's begin with an enslaved man in Carlisle who sought his freedom in Philadelphia. His name was George Cooper, as you can see on our first slide here. And in 1802, George Cooper, who was born into a form of bondage in Carlisle that required him to give 31 years of labor to his enslaver, he decided that he was done with that experience, and he left Carlisle for Philadelphia. While in Philadelphia, as you can see from this newspaper article, he was caught, found out, captured, and jailed. His enslaver was a judge in Carlisle named Samuel Laird. You can see one of the judges of the court common pleas, the local trial court.
Corey, can I interrupt you for 1 second? I had
Please
a
do.
comment that someone can't see the slide. Are other people seeing the slide? S- I can see the slide, so I don't know.
Hmm. I believe I see the slides. I believe I'm
It's
sharing the
okay.
slides.
Okay. Other people are saying yes, so I'm not sure what's going on in that
Okay.
case. Maybe looking the view options up at the top. Um, they'll see it. If you play with that, maybe you'll see it.
Okay. As long as Zoom is working the
I
way
think it is. I
intended.
don't not sure what's happening in that one account. All right. Sorry for interrupting.
Not a problem. This If you can't see the slides, it's going to be a tough talk. So I'd rather we get this sorted out at the beginning here. But I will continue and hope that that resolves itself in chat. Uh, George Cooper makes his way to Philadelphia and decides he's not going to go back to Carlisle. Samuel Laird writes a series of letters to contacts he has in Philadelphia, trying to encourage George Cooper to come back so they could hash it out, so they could try to come to an agreement. And according to a man named Isaac Hopper, who is a white Quaker abolitionist in Philadelphia, he wrote this summary that I'm drawing from. According to Isaac Hopper, George Cooper explained, "I have no wish to go back to Carlisle." His explanation was that even if Samuel Laird, his enslaver, recused himself from the case having to do with George's freedom, that he had friends who sat on the judiciary. George Cooper knew he was not going to get an impartial trial in Cumberland County. And so he refused to return. And eventually, Samuel Laird dropped the case, decided it wasn't worth his trying to retrieve George Cooper from Philadelphia to get him to come back to Carlisle to continue serving him. This story about Cooper's bravado and his success in seeking his own freedom concludes on the following note. This is from the 1840s, so 4 decades after George Cooper leaves Carlisle. There's a little epilogue to his story. George continues to reside in Philly and conducts himself discreetly. I frequently see him when I go there, and he always looks respectable. And then the conclusion, both the master and servant mutually gave each other a good character. Well, I don't know about that, but what I do know is that George Cooper successfully got out of bondage in central Pennsylvania and lived a life mostly of freedom in the port city of Philadelphia. That was published in the Anti-Slavery Standard, an abolitionist newspaper in the 1840s. And his was just but one of several strategies that I'm going to make the focus of the lecture tonight. There are three Black freedom strategies that I really want to talk about. The first is absconding, what you might have heard in a high school or college classroom as running away, right? Deciding to take one's life into one's own hands and make an attempt at freedom somewhere else. So absconding. Then there is litigating, turning to the judiciary, to the court system, in an attempt to legally establish one's freedom in that way. And finally, a third strategy, a bit of a catch-all that I'll explain later on, is merely surviving, um, whether that meant surviving long enough to be liberated, or in the case of the era of gradual abolition, aging into freedom, just enduring the institution of bondage and coming out the other side a freed person. So those are the three strategies I want to focus on. Before we get into that, though, I do need to set the stage a little bit. Kara mentioned that my book is titled or subtitled Pennsylvania Slavery in the Age of Gradual Abolition. And so it's a history that really begins with the act that calls for the institution's dissolution with gradual abolition. Pennsylvania was the first state to pass a gradual abolition law. This happened during the US Revolutionary War. You can see it was enacted on March 1st, 1780. But this was a bit of a controversial proposition at the time. I shouldn't say a bit, it had never been done before. The law passed 34 to 21 in the state assembly, so a significant contingent of state representatives were opposed to passing this gradual abolition law. Cumberland County delegates, however, actually voted 5-0 in favor of the statute However, there were political repercussions for their doing so. Like I said, 5-0 in favor. There were two representatives who abstained. They didn't vote one way or the other. But the following election year, four of those representatives were not returned to the legislature. They were voted out, and all four of them were replaced with slaveholders. So there were consequences for voting for an abolition law in central Pennsylvania during this time period. Well, how did this law work? It's called gradual abolition. If you're familiar with the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery all at once, this is not the way it happened in Pennsylvania. The way gradual abolition worked, and this became a model for other northern states, was that anyone born before the act was passed would remain bound for life, but their children would go free at the age of 28. So that's what I meant by aging into freedom as a form of surviving slavery during this time period. Both of these groups, those born before the law and those born after, they had to be registered. Enslavers were obligated to go to their county courthouse and register the people that they claimed to own as property. Now, what this means for historians is that we have a pretty robust record of what slavery looked like in 1780, 90, the early 1800s. In fact, in the 50 years after gradual abolition was enacted in Pennsylvania, enslavers registered between 8 and 10,000 people as property. Now, I know that's a bit of a wide range. The reason we don't know the precise number is because not every county's records have survived. I have, over the course of my dissertation and now book research, compiled a data set of more than 6,300 registrations, but I don't have any from Philadelphia County or York County, whose records appear not to have survived. Similar for Franklin County at a certain time period, and those were centers of slaveholding during this time period. So the number is certainly higher than 6,300 registrations. I like to focus in on the actual law itself, an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. And this is merely a point of symbolism. But when you put gradual before the word abolition, when you modify something like liberty or emancipation, uh, you can see that it actually forces abolition onto two lines. It breaks the central promise of abolition. It turns it into something else. And so I keep that in mind when I study Pennsylvania slavery during the age of gradual abolition. Well, what do these registrations look like? I know this is difficult to read. I'm going to make it a bit easier for everyone. Here's a registration document from Cumberland County. An enslaver named Matthew Loudon was registering 3 people as his property under Pennsylvania's gradual abolition law. Their names were Dover, Tyra, and Sal. You can see that they were 24 years old, 19 years old, and only 9 months old. The registration of Sal is particularly tragic because had she been born just a few months later, she would have been born after the law was enacted and consequently would have only owed 28 years as opposed to a lifetime of labor. But the Pennsylvania General Assembly had to put an arbitrary deadline somewhere. And so children like Sal suffered as a result. We don't know for sure whether or not Dover, Tyra, and Sal were a family. We merely know that Matthew Loudon claimed all of them as his property in 1780. This does bring me to my first Black freedom-making strategy I addressed, though, which is absconding. Because Dover was not content to remain in bondage, and we know this because of runaway slave advertisements, documents published in newspapers where enslavers tried to capture individuals who made a bid for their own freedom. And this is precisely what Dover did in 1788, 8 years after he was registered as a slave in Cumberland County. You can see that he sought refuge, tried to get away from the Loudon household. And remarkably, we actually know a bit about what happened to Dover. This is not always the case with these kinds of records, right? It's only a snapshot of a moment in time, these advertisements. But the same man, Dover, was advertised for 5 years later. You can see here, he's now going by the name Thomas Dover, but we know it's the same individual because the advertisement itself says that he formerly lived with Matthew Loudon in Cumberland County. And if you scan the advertisement, you'll see that he was now living out in Allegheny County near Pittsburgh. He had been sold at some point in the intervening 5 years by Matthew Loudon, or perhaps someone else, to William Reed, hundreds of miles away. And we don't know what happened to Tyra and Sal. We just know that Thomas Dover was sold west. And perhaps the reason that he was trying to escape from William Reed was to make his way back to Cumberland County to see family, friends, or relatives. We also know this is the same man, or it suggests that this is the same man because of these remarkable descriptions of his talent as a fiddler, that he was a violin player, described as such in both of these advertisements. But I want to bring your attention to the postscript, the nota bene at the very bottom of that second notice. Thomas Dover had a pass signed by Mr. Bradford, an attorney of the Western Court, and Mr. Benjamin Reed, which, according to William Reed, was counterfeit. He had a counterfeit pass. And this raises several questions. Was it actually counterfeit, or did William Reed believe it was counterfeit? If so, how did Thomas Dover attain it? Was he literate? Did he write it himself? What exactly did it say? What was Thomas Dover giving himself permission to do with this pass? I don't know the answer to those questions, but I do know that other enslaved people made uses of pass systems and the legal landscape of slavery to try to make it easier for themselves to seek freedom. Another example is a woman named Lucy. 16 years after Thomas Dover left Pittsburgh, perhaps to try to make it back to Cumberland County, Lucy did something really remarkable. She walked into the Cumberland County courthouse and she checked on her own registration status. Right? She obtained a paper some time ago of Mr. Bovard, that's Charles Bovard, the county clerk at the time, certifying that she was not recorded under the name of Robert Culberson, her enslaver's late husband, which she will make use of as a pass. So Lucy, like Thomas Dover, had enough legal knowledge, a sense of the way the system worked in Pennsylvania to try to increase their odds of success when running away, which is a pretty remarkable thing. Lucy, in particular, having the audacity to check on her own status at the county courthouse. Now, this was not limited to just Thomas Dover and Lucy. In fact, we see this kind of thing become a bit of a trope in runaway slave advertisements from this time period, and really throughout the archive of American slavery writ large. You will see enslavers place an advertisement for someone, in this case, a man named Castile. And then later on in the advertisement, they'll exclaim, "It is suspected he has procured a forged pass." They didn't know for sure, but the idea was that these kinds of things were circulating, that there was a black market economy in fake papers that enabled enslaved people to try to get away with it, essentially, because if they were stopped by someone on the street and asked who they were, they could use those papers to claim their own freedom, and that could buy them some time. Now, I want to bring your attention to the name of the person who placed this advertisement for Castile, because if you take one person away from this talk tonight who you might want to know as a remarkable figure in the history of Cumberland County, it's Castile. Because in 1802, he was living outside of Harrisburg and he was enslaved by a man named James Caldwell. But we have several other advertisements describing this same man, Castile, dating back to 1794, 1797. Here are descriptions of the same man. He was owned by different men in 94, 97, 1802, who continued to time and time again seek his freedom, to decide it was worth the risk and the possible consequences of being caught to try to get away from his enslaver. Before he was in Harrisburg, you can see from the registrations on the left or the advertisements on the left that he was in Franklin County. But I happen to know, because of his unique name, Castile, that he was actually born and registered in Cumberland County. His registration document put him in the household of a man named John Cessna. And so in his young life, Castile was sold from Cessna to perhaps James Dickey, and then to William Hayes, and then to James Caldwell. And after that, I'm not entirely sure what happens to Castile. I hope that after 1802, he secured his freedom for good. Runaway advertisements are not the only way that historians know about this kind of legal knowledge, but it certainly is perhaps the most common. I do want to show you, however, another way that we know a bit about Black legal knowledge and the risks of absconding, trying to secure one's freedom. What you're looking at here is actually a record of a man from Lancaster County, so across the Susquehanna River, who, like Lucy after him, actually, walked into the county courthouse to check on his own freedom status. On the application of a Negro man who says his name is John and has lived with James Kelly as a slave, I have searched the register, but do not find that James Kelly had ever made an entry of the said John. And so at the end of this document, what you have is permit the above John to pass. And that was actually signed by the mayor of Harrisburg. So you put all of these pieces together, what you have is a man named John who checked on his own status and had enough credibility that he was never registered as property, that, to my knowledge, James Kelly, his enslaver, never placed an ad in the newspaper trying to get him back. So even without a runaway advertisement, we can see the evidence of this kind of freedom seeking and how much easier that could be when enslaved people had some sense of the legal landscape. John knew or had an inkling that he was being held illegally without a registration, and he confirmed as much at the county courthouse in 1788. And this brings me to my next freedom-seeking strategy, because James Kelly could have contested John's claim, right? Plenty of other enslavers did. Not everyone was as bold as Lucy or as John. And so some enslaved people went to the courts to litigate their freedom, to try to get a judge or a jury to say, yes, you should in fact be free. Now, in the late 18th century, in Cumberland County's records, you have a handful of these every year, one, maybe two. But something remarkable happened in 1800. And to this day, I'm not entirely sure why, but I do have some thoughts. In 1800, at least 20 freedom suits were filed in Cumberland County. You're looking here at the docket book from the Court of Common Pleas. You can see it's for the April term 1800. And there were two freedom suits, habeas corpus petitions in a row. The first for two children, a young girl named Hannah and a boy named Harry. The second for an adult woman named Bex. They were seeking their freedom in the county courts, perhaps because they had an inkling that they either were not registered or had been registered improperly or something to that effect. Unfortunately, the papers for all of these cases, many of them have been lost. And for quite a while, all I had as a historian trying to put these stories back together were these tantalizing entries in the docket book, but with no more information from the legal records themselves. Eventually, I discovered that some of these papers did survive, and they made their way onto a microfilm reel at some point in the 1970s. So I've slowly but surely been able to start learning more about some of these individual stories. And if you remember Lucy, who walked into the Cumberland County Courthouse to check on her status. I mentioned that Charles Bovard was the clerk of courts when Lucy did this in 1809. But previous to being the clerk helping Lucy check on her own freedom status, he was actually a defendant in a freedom suit where another woman was suing him, Charles Bovard, for her freedom. And that woman's name was Sabina. In 1802, Sabina sued Charles Bovard, filed a writ of habeas corpus, claiming that she was owed her freedom. And the words that you see scrawled that are perpendicular, that you can't exactly read, that is Charles Bovard explaining why he believes he had a legal right to hold Sabina as his property. And his argument was as follows. Charles Bovard claimed that although Sabina had been, quote, emancipated by her mistress, Mary Ann Thompson, that this emancipation was conditional. Yes, Sabina had been emancipated from slavery, but it was on the condition that she, quote, serve Jane Gibson until she become of the age of 28. So this is interesting, right? Sabina was born before 1780 and registered, presumably, as a slave for life. But she had an agreement with Mary Ann Thompson that she would only serve until 28 instead. And she was going to serve Jane Gibson to the age of 28. So how does Charles Bovard have Sabina? Well, he claims that at some point, Jane Gibson assigned the residue of Sabina's time to him, Charles Bovard. And so because of the existence of these papers, we know a bit more about Sabina's story, about why she was making this claim to freedom. But unfortunately, even when we have case papers, we don't always know the outcome. We don't know if Sabina was successful in suing Charles Bovard for her freedom in 1802. We only know that she did it and that she believed she had a freedom claim. This, of course, raises, unfortunately, more questions than it answered. And like I said, the big one for me is what's going on in 1800? How do you go from 1 or 2 freedom suits a year to 20 in 1800? And I have a couple thoughts about this. One possibility comes from across the river in Lancaster County, because I happen to know that in 1799, a white abolitionist named William Webb was engaged in work with the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which was a Philadelphia-based anti-slavery organization that provided a lot of legal aid to, again, mostly Philadelphia-based enslaved people. Scholars who work on the history of slavery in Philadelphia often use these records when they're reconstructing the past. But I have used these other sets of records, right? The registries from the county, from the interior counties. But William Webb was actually engaged in the process of trying to liberate individuals in Lancaster. What you're looking at here is actually some financial accounting of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society paying William Webb money for legal services he'd provide in Lancaster to try to obtain people's freedom. And it was spelled out even more clearly on the next page in these records, where in the PAS, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society records, they claim that they have a letter from William Webb of Lancaster from October of 1800 that was read, and William Webb was claiming there are in Lancaster County a number of slaves held by defective records. And he proposed that with the agreement of the Abolition Committee, that one of those cases might be brought before the local courts. So there were white abolitionists who were engaged in anti-slavery organizing around this time period, who were going and checking on defective records, right? We see this in the labor of William Webb in Lancaster County. I've not seen any comparable evidence that this is what was going on in Cumberland. I haven't seen any kind of evidence like that for Carlisle. What I do know about Carlisle comes from a different kind of document, and I need to thank Barb Bartos once again for bringing this document to my attention. It is very difficult to see, but I'll explain what it is that you're looking at. This isn't in the records of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. This is a deposition, and it's a deposition by a man named Isaac Francis. And what Isaac Francis is swearing to is that an iron baron named John Walker, who lived in East Pennsboro, that he was detaining a male called Sam unlawfully. And then here's what Isaac Francis says: as this deponent doth verily believe the said Negro Sam is not on record, nor never was on record, as this deponent searched the office of recording of Negroes twice and could find no record of Sam. Isaac Francis was a free black man, and in 1803, we know he was going to the courthouse despite the fact that he could not read or write, or at the very least, he could not write. He's making his X, his mark, instead of a signature. That's something that individuals who could not sign their name did. But nevertheless, he is engaged in this activism of trying to liberate individuals in Cumberland County, trying to free Sam from laboring on an iron plantation, doing mining work. And once again, I do not know if Isaac Francis was successful in getting Sam out of bondage. But what we can conclude from putting the Webb story and the Isaac Francis story together is that black and white anti-slavery organizers were beginning to look at these registration documents to try to find errors, to try to find defects, to use the language of William Webb, that would allow someone to sue for freedom, a pretty remarkable thing. After 1800, the cases become a bit more sporadic again. That was really a moment of activism in the Cumberland Valley. This is going to bring me to my final strategy for the night: surviving. And I want to read quickly just a paragraph from my dissertation, which is a copy of which is at the Cumberland County Historical Society. So if you're interested in more about what I'm talking tonight, it's mostly in chapter 5. But these are some survival strategies that I find to be just so creative from this time period. Some Black Pennsylvanians negotiated conditional freedom contracts with their enslavers. In Lancaster County in the summer of 1799, Jack and his enslaver, James Bingham, agreed that Jack would serve James for another 6 years in exchange for room, board, and 6 months of schooling. Jack also bargained for, quote, time to do the business of a sexton for the congregation of Chestnut, with the understanding that he, and not James, would collect all of the money from that service. So he was negotiating a kind of semi-freedom. In 1797, a man named Joe and his enslaver, George McCulloch, agreed that Joe would have his freedom after 4 years, and that during that time, George was, quote, to call upon him not above 9 months in every year. So one of the 4 seasons every year was going to be for Joe, not for George. 3 years later, Joe filed a copy of this agreement with the Lancaster County Clerk so that he could more easily prove his freedom should he ever need to do so. Joe was not the only Black person to ensure that the clerk had a record of their freedom papers. A man named Pleasance filed his wife and child's manumission papers in 1797. A man named James, who had been enslaved in New Jersey, filed his own papers 2 years later when he arrived as a free man in Pennsylvania. Some Pennsylvanians who were registered as lifetime slaves in Lancaster County even used the occasion of their birthdays to advocate for freedom. That Nan, Jane, and York, and actually Sabina, who I've already mentioned, all negotiated manumission agreements that granted them freedom when they turned 28, demonstrates the power that a culture of gradual abolition could have on enslavers. So these negotiations, these efforts to get it in writing that, no, I will not be enslaved for life. Instead, I will serve a certain period of time. These were remarkable negotiations that get at the creative strategies of Black freedom seekers in the early United States. And there are 2 other stories I want to bring particular attention to. One is from a man named Jim, because Jim actually engaged in all 3 strategies that I mentioned tonight. You're looking at a court case, Mulatto Jim versus William Rippey from 1800, right? Part of that wave of 1800 activism. Jim sued for his freedom, but was unsuccessful in the courts. And we know that he was unsuccessful because William Rippey placed an advertisement in the local papers the following year trying to recover Jim. So 1800, he sues for freedom. 1801, he runs away. He seeks his own freedom outside the legal system. But I have every reason to believe that Jim was caught and returned to bondage because almost 20 years later, when William Rippey wrote his last will and testaments, a man named Jim appears in that document. But in that document, Rippey promises Jim his freedom. What he actually says is that Jim and Rachel shall in 2 months after my decease be emancipated and freed from all servitude, provided that they conduct themselves obediently and well during my lifetime. And I do hereby bequeath to each of them $50 to be paid and deducted from the cost of my estate. So Jim, he tried the course. He tried absconding, but in the end, it was a matter of survival. And when William Rippey died in 1819, he reeded freedom at almost the age of 60 years old. But not everyone was as fortunate as Jim and Rachel, if you can call it that, because if you continue reading William Rippey's last will and testament, he says that my Negroes Charles and Nance are to be sold, and my executors are requested to prefer purchasers of known humanity. And what a turn of phrase that is, purchasers of known humanity. This is Pennsylvania, almost in 1820. You have a slave sale being negotiated, but at least there would be purchasers of known humanity. And the story I want to leave you with tonight is the story of a family, the Wood family, who embarked on one of the most risky and audacious survival strategies that I've come across in my research. And I'm about to throw a lot of text at you once again, but we're going to go through it together. What you're looking at here is a writ of removal, and it's signed by George Woods, Esther Woods, Mila Woods, and James Guston. Now, a writ of removal was a legal document required to take enslaved people out of the state of Pennsylvania. The fact that there was legislation requiring this kind of action at all is somewhat remarkable. Not all northern states had these policies in place. It was essentially meant to prevent enslavers from getting around the abolition law just by going to a slave state, right? So James Guston negotiates this writ of removal with the Wood family. And what it says is that George and Esther, well, it turns out they were lawfully married in Carlisle. It goes on to explain that Mila was George's mother and that Esther, George's wife, did not have any parents who were living to give their blessing. But George and Esther were declaring their consent. They were agreeing to go with the Gustons to Mississippi. And the explanation that the writ gives is that George wanted to remain with Mila, who was property of the Gustons family. I should say, however, that this document concludes by explaining that James Guston offered to liberate the two in 1824 if they agreed to go to Mississippi. This is 1817. So come to Mississippi with me for 7 years, and I'll emancipate you in 1824. Now, why might they do this? A couple of reasons. 1824 was earlier than they would have been liberated if they stayed in Pennsylvania. So by going to Mississippi, they could become free at a younger age than if they elected to remain behind. So there was an incentive that James Guston gave the Woods. But I think there's another reason, because one day after the Gustons and the Woods agreed to this writ of removal, James Guston registered a child named Mary as his property in Cumberland County, one day after the writ of removal. Now, I have every reason to believe that Mary was George and Esther's daughter, and that by agreeing to go to Mississippi, they were agreeing with the Gustons that Mary would be theirs, that the Gustons would not make a claim to try to hold on to Mary once George and Esther were free. This is my hypothesis. at least, because the three of them did go to Mississippi. We know this. They show up in documents in Natchez, Mississippi. And one's pretty remarkable that harkens back to the Black legal knowledge that they had gained living in Carlisle, because once they got to Mississippi, they had that writ of removal registered at the local courthouse in Mississippi, right? They weren't going to take any risks that this legal document wasn't recognized by the local government. So they got it registered in Natchez, Mississippi. Well, what happens to the Wood family? James Guston dies almost immediately of yellow fever. And the Woods decide that they're going to return north with his widow, who didn't want to be in Mississippi without her deceased husband. So the Gustons and the Woods returned to Philadelphia, where they had other family. So the Woods go from Carlisle to Natchez to Philadelphia. And I know they end up in Philadelphia, but what happened to them for sure is a bit of guesswork, but it's guesswork that I find compelling, because in 1850, so 35 years after all of this has gone down, a family consisting of George, Esther, and Mary Wood appear in the 1850 census as free people. And what's more, their birthplaces are identified as Pennsylvania. And why does this matter? Well, because if you look below them at the other children that George and Esther had, George, Charles, Isabella, Samuel, Francis, all of them are explicitly identified as having been born in Philadelphia. So the way I read this is that George, Esther, and Mary gambled, well, George and Esther really, that the Gustons would make good on their promise, that they used the Black legal knowledge they gained growing up in a place like Cumberland County to file their conditional freedom papers at the courthouse in Mississippi, and that then they made their way back to an increasingly free state in Pennsylvania, where they established free lives for themselves to the east. And that's where I want to end tonight, with the remarkable story of survival of the Wood family. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. Kara, are you around? Oh,
Uh,
perfect.
I'm here. We just had one come in on the chat. I'll read it. Did the enslaved wait until they gained their freedom before having children?
Ooh, that is a very good question. And I wish I had a more detailed answer to give, but I can actually go right back to the Wood family to give at least one guess. Um, we know from the registration documents that they didn't always wait, whether that was because waiting until the age of 28 would be quite a long time to wait before starting a family in the early 19th century, right? Uh, we can reconstruct family trees of individuals who experienced term slavery, who had children before they were liberated. So that was definitely going on, which is a tragedy. But in the case of the Woods, it doesn't seem like they had, according to the census at least, any children in Mississippi. They seem to have waited until they got to Philadelphia to grow their family. Now, there could be any number of reasons for that, uh, but it's very rare to see this kind of clear story in a census return like this, right? The gap between Pennsylvania and Philadelphia as birthplaces is so instructive. So some people thought to wait, others didn't have the choice. It was a really complicated decision that individuals had to make for themselves.
Another question. Did the mulatto population go higher for the enslaved?
So yes, according to the county slave registries. And this is a deeply troubling fact, but it's not clear exactly how to interpret this. If you look at the racial designations of people who were registered as lifetime slaves in 1780 in Cumberland County. And if you look at the racial designations of their children born after 1780, you actually see a significant and steady increase in the percentage of children who are identified as mixed race rather than as just Black. This is a reminder of some of the interracial sexual violence that's a hallmark of slavery in all slave societies. But it also could just be that over time, individuals were being more discerning in their registrations of individual people. Um, for example, in 1780, individuals would register entire groups all at once, and they might use the shorthand Negroes for everyone on that document. Whereas after 1780, individuals were registered when they were born, right? So it wasn't a single time registration, it was a sliding scale as new children were born. And just that difference between describing a group of people using the term Negro as a generic term for African ancestry versus the specificity you get with individual registrations makes me wary of reading too much into that increase in the mulatto population, but it's absolutely there in the archives. And it's not unique to Cumberland County. There are other counties in Pennsylvania where you see the same rise. Fayette County and Allegheny County come to mind in particular.
Okay, we got two more questions. One, thank you for the powerful presentation. Where can we find the abolition newspapers? They're not on the typical subscriber services like newspapers.com, are they? Only on microfilm and archives, question mark. Would be nice if they're digitized.
Yeah, so I actually think I grabbed the National Anti-Slavery Standard from newspapers.com. If I didn't, I got it from there's a database through Gale called Early American Newspapers. But if memory serves, I can't promise this, but I actually think that a lot of abolitionist newspapers have been digitized and put, and there's no paywall. So it might be the kind of thing that you could just Google and find access to some abolitionist newspapers outside of a paywall structure. I know that isn't entirely satisfying, but I do believe that that is the case. Um, yeah,
Okay. Were you able to find the registration records on the Cumberland County website, or did you go through the original documents?
both. So the good folks over at the Cumberland County Archives have digitized the Cumberland County individual registrations and the clerk's collected record book of everyone. And so we actually have uh, multiple sources of the Cumberland County slave registries. As part of the reason my project is anchored in Cumberland County is because it has the most complete set of records of any county, to my knowledge, in the state of Pennsylvania. And there are other counties who are close, but none of them had as large of a population of enslaved people as Cumberland did. And so it's really a remarkable set of records. Part of the reason that I talk so much about Lancaster as well is because even though they don't have as many individual documents, they have full transcriptions of all of the surviving records. And in Lancaster County, enslavers got in the habit of identifying family relationships by saying in the records, I'm registering so and so, and she's the daughter of so and so. And that allows you to begin constructing family trees and understanding more of the family life of enslaved people in the Pennsylvania interior in the early 19th century.
Okay, thank you. Could the enslavers call the enslaved, such as servants, to go around registering them as slaves?
Servant was a euphemism for enslaved in all parts of the country during this time period. And so if someone was referring to their servant and they were Black in the 1780s, 90s, early 19th century, they almost certainly meant enslaved. And so just calling someone a servant wouldn't necessarily be evidence that an enslaver was trying to skirt the law. It was common parlance at the time. but there absolutely were enslavers who tried to get around the laws by um, doing things like emancipating and signing to lengthy indentured contracts, individuals who they might want to hold beyond the age of 28. And there was also some ambiguity. I started tonight by mentioning George Cooper, who went to Philadelphia and sought his freedom there. He was able to get his freedom because he proved descent from a white grandmother, and slavery was passed from black woman to black woman to black woman. And so if you had a free white ancestor on your maternal side, that was enough to establish one's freedom in the eyes of early national courts. And I bring this up because George Cooper should actually never have been held at all. And Samuel Laird likely knew what his ancestry was and was holding him anyway. So Laird didn't need to call him a servant to get around the laws. He just needed to lean on the fact that Pennsylvania was permissive of these 28-year periods of term slavery to try to take advantage of someone's race and status.
Thank you so much for the presentation. This is remarkable research. It's so remarkable to see how you've connected these small and desperate threads in such a powerful stories. What research do you feel still needs to be done on this topic? What is your next project?
Uh, um, that is such an excellent academic question. So I am interested in expanding the source of my legal archive. So I know Cumberland County's freedom suits pretty well, but I didn't have time to travel to all of the county courthouses in Pennsylvania to try to look and see if there were, freedom summers like the summer of 1800 in other places. And I would love to do that as a related project to this one. I don't think I'm going to have the time to do that archival work before I end up publishing uh, my first book, but that is work that I absolutely feel needs to be done is the local county studies of Black freedom suits in Pennsylvania during this time period, because especially if there are case papers, then there are stories. There are so many more than the ones that I told you about tonight. So that's work that still needs to be done. One second project that I have is looking at the role that enslaved people played in Western colonization in Western Pennsylvania, Western New York, and Eastern Ohio during this time period, because the history of slavery in Pennsylvania isn't even confined to the centers. Cumberland County is a real center of slaveholding in Pennsylvania in 1780, but there are these rural, remote fringe cases, like Potter County, Pennsylvania, up north on the border of New York. There's an enslaved man who is one of the first non-Europeans to end up in that county. Erie County, up, in the Erie Triangle, the northwestern corner of the state, there were enslaved people who were brought with the white founding families to Erie County, and a source base for this that I think scholars need to spend more time on are late 19th century county histories. These old published county uh, histories are full of these stories, and I was just surprised at how often they remark on a Black founder. So to tell the story of Black Americans, enslaved Americans, and sort of the founding of Western frontier outposts is something that I'm interested in doing, because I don't think that story has been fully told for the Northwest. It's been told for the Southwest, but not for the Northwest.
You have several comments thanking you and saying amazing presentation. Another question just came in. Will you be placing copies of your book in the Cumberland County Library system?
Absolutely. So we're still a few years from its publication. Like I mentioned, the dissertation is already at the Historical Society, but I would not be able to forgive myself if I didn't donate a copy of that book to the Cumberland County Historical Society.
All right. Any other questions? Give it a second here just in case someone's typing.
Not a problem.
I do want to thank you. I like the perspective and um, the advocacy and activism within the Black community. And it's not just the white savior that we normally get when we hear, freedom seeking. So I particularly liked this take on it and how they were advocating um, amongst the enslaved themselves to attain their freedom.
Yeah, right. John marches into the Lancaster County Courthouse in 1788.
It's crazy.
That's 8 years after this law is passed, and how what did he know, and who did he know it from?
Hmm. All right. I'm not seeing any other questions. Um, So thank you for everyone for tuning in tonight. Thank you, Corey.
Thank
This
you
was
so much for having me.
fantastic. And I know it was filmed, so this will be on our YouTube channel soon. So if you wanted to go back and re-listen to something, it'll be available online. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Mm.